The Invisible Warrior, Part 1. It was 3:37 in the morning on November 10th, 1918, and the war had less than a day left to live. Lance Corporal Joseph Nightwind lay motionless in a shell crater somewhere in France, his rifle resting across a shattered tree branch, his eyes scanning the German trenches 400 yards away through the pre-dawn darkness. He had been in this position for 6 hours, had not moved except to breathe, had not made a sound. The Germans in those trenches had no idea he was there. They never did. That is why 547 of them were dead. Joseph Nightwind was a Ojibwe from Madeline Island in Lake Superior, Wisconsin. Before the war, he had been a fisherman and hunter, spending his days on the water hauling nets, and his evenings in the forest tracking deer and bear. He had learned patience from fishing, learned to read weather and water, and the subtle signs that told him where fish were running. He learned stillness from hunting, learned to move through forest without snapping a twig, learned to wait for hours without fidgeting until the perfect shot presented itself. These were skills passed down through generations of Ojibwe hunters, skills that connected him to his ancestors and his land, skills that had nothing to do with war. Then in August 1914, a war started in Europe that had nothing to do with Madeline Island or Lake Superior or the Ojibwe people. It was a white man's war, a conflict between empires over territory and treaties and alliances that meant nothing to indigenous communities in America who were still fighting their own battles against the government that had taken their land and tried to erase their culture. Joseph had no obligation to enlist. Indigenous people were not even recognized as full American citizens in 1914. They could not vote. They faced discrimination and marginalization. The government that was now asking them to fight for the empire was the same government that had forced them onto reservations and banned their traditional practices. But Joseph enlisted anyway, walking into a recruitment office in Bayfield, Wisconsin in August 1914, barely 2 weeks after war was declared. He was 23 years old, stood 5'9" tall, and could shoot a rifle better than anyone the recruiting sergeant had ever seen. 10 years earlier, Joseph had been 13 years old, pulling fishing nets on Lake Superior with his father and grandfather. The water was dark and cold, even in summer, and the work was hard. His hands were already calloused from handling rope and nets. His grandfather, who everyone called Old Bear, spoke mostly in Ojibwe and rarely wasted words in any language. But he taught Joseph everything that mattered: how to read the sky before dawn and know if storms were coming, how to feel the pull of a net and know if fish were there or if you were just dragging weight through empty water. How to wait, that was the most important lesson. How to let time pass without anxiety or impatience. How to exist in the moment and trust that what you sought would come if you were patient enough and paid attention. In the forests around Madeline Island, Old Bear taught Joseph to hunt, not the white man's way, walking through the woods, making noise and hoping to stumble upon something. The Ojibwe way, moving like smoke, placing each foot with absolute care, testing the ground before committing weight, learning to see the forest as a living thing that would reveal its secrets if you knew how to listen. They would spend entire afternoons tracking a single deer. Old Bear would point out the signs, here where the animal had paused to eat, there where it had become alert and changed direction. See how the grass is bent. Notice the broken twig. Read the story the forest is telling you. Then would come the waiting, finding the right position, settling into absolute stillness. Old Bear could remain motionless for hours, barely seeming to breathe. Joseph learned to do the same, learned to quiet his mind until he became part of the landscape, until the deer would walk past him without knowing a human being was there. That was when Old Bear would give the signal. One shot, clean, respectful. They would give thanks to the animal's spirit. Waste nothing. Honor the life that was given. Joseph's father had died when Joseph was 16. Pneumonia, which took so many on the reservation where health care was almost non-existent and government promises meant nothing. After that, it was just Joseph and Old Bear working the nets and hunting the forests. The government agent who managed the reservation tried to force them to farm, said fishing and hunting were old ways that needed to die. Old Bear ignored him. The agent threatened to cut their rations. Old Bear still ignored him. They survived on what the lake and forest provided the way their people had survived for generations before the white men came. Joseph had a younger sister who had been taken to a boarding school when she was 7. Government policy: Take the children, cut their hair, forbid them from speaking their language, beat the Indian out of them. Joseph had not seen her in 6 years, did not know if she was alive. Old Bear never spoke of her, but Joseph saw the grief in his grandfather's eyes. Joseph also had a nephew, Thomas, his sister's son, who had been born before she was taken. Thomas was 12 years old in 1914, living with Joseph and Old Bear, learning the same lessons Joseph had learned. The boy was quick and eager, good with his hands, patient, like his great-grandfather. Joseph taught him to shoot with an old rifle, the same one Joseph had learned with. Thomas would practice for hours, and Joseph would correct his breathing, his grip, his patience. The boy was a natural. Why did Joseph enlist? The historical record does not give us his thoughts, does not tell us what he was feeling when he signed the papers. Maybe he wanted adventure. Maybe he needed the money. Military pay being better than what a fisherman could make. Maybe he believed the recruiting posters that said this was a war for freedom and democracy, not yet understanding that those words meant different things for white Americans than they did for indigenous people. Or maybe, like many indigenous soldiers who would enlist in both world wars, he wanted to prove that his people were as brave and capable as any others, that they deserve respect and recognition that American society refused to give them in peacetime. The recruiting sergeant in Bayfield was skeptical when Joseph walked in. The sergeant was a thick man with a red face and suspicious eyes, and he looked Joseph up and down with clear doubt. Another Indian, his expression said, probably drunk, probably useless. Joseph said nothing, just stood there with the patience Old Bear had taught him, waiting. The sergeant finally sighed and pushed papers across the desk. Name, age, occupation. Joseph wrote carefully. His handwriting was crude but readable. The boarding schools his sister had been taken to taught reading and writing, but Joseph had learned from a missionary who came to the island once a month and did not care much if Indian children could write proper. Can you shoot? The sergeant asked. Joseph nodded. Every Indian says he can shoot, the sergeant said. Most cannot hit the broadside of a barn. There was a rifle range behind the recruitment office. The sergeant took Joseph out back, handed him an old Springfield rifle, and pointed at targets 100 yards away. 5 shots, he said. Show me what you can do. Joseph checked the rifle, worked the action, felt the weight and balance. It was heavier than his hunting rifle, but the principles were the same. He raised the rifle, found his breathing, let everything else fall away. The way Old Bear had taught him, the way hundreds of hours in the forest had trained him. He fired 5 times, 5 shots in a tight group in the center of the target. The sergeant walked down range to check, came back with a different expression. Where did you learn to shoot like that? He asked. My grandfather, Joseph said. The forest, the deer. The sergeant nodded slowly. All right then, he said. You are in. Joseph signed the papers. Private Joseph Nightwind, United States Army, attached to volunteer units heading to Canada and then to France. He would ship out in September. That night, Joseph walked back to Madeline Island. The ferry crossed in the late afternoon and the water was calm and dark. He stood on the deck and watched the mainland disappear behind him and thought about what he had done. Old Bear was waiting at the dock. Somehow the old man always knew when Joseph was coming, even when there was no way to send word ahead. They walked back to the small cabin they shared without speaking. Old Bear built a fire. They sat and Old Bear filled his pipe with tobacco and smoked in silence for a long time. Finally he spoke in Ojibwe. You are going to war. Yes, Joseph said. You know this is not our war, yes. But you are going anyway, yes. Old Bear smoked for a while longer. Then he said, still in Ojibwe, you will walk between 2 worlds now. You will do things that cannot be undone. You will see things that will change who you are. Remember who you were before. Remember where you come from. The spirits of our ancestors will watch over you, but you must honor them. Every life you take, you must honor. Do not become what the war wants you to become. Joseph nodded. He did not fully understand then what his grandfather meant. He would understand later. That night, Old Bear performed a ceremony. He burned sage and sweetgrass and sang old songs in a language even older than Ojibwe songs that had been passed down through more generations than anyone could count. He marked Joseph's forehead with ash and gave him a small pouch of tobacco to carry. For offerings, he said, for the dead, both your dead and theirs. All warriors deserve respect. Thomas watched from the doorway, 12 years old and trying not to cry. After the ceremony, Joseph sat with the boy. "I want to go with you," Thomas said. "You are too young. I will be older soon. When I am 16, I can enlist." Joseph put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Stay here," he said. "Learn from old Bear. Take care of him. Learn to fish and hunt. That is more important than war." "But you are going." "I am going," Joseph said. "But I wish I was not." He left in September, taking the ferry to the mainland and then the train east. Old Bear and Thomas stood on the dock and watched him go. Joseph did not look back. If he looked back, he might not leave. The training was basic and rushed. Britain desperately needed men at the front and was not interested in lengthy preparation. Joseph learned to march in formation, to follow orders, to maintain his equipment. But he already knew how to shoot. The Army rifles were different from his hunting rifle back home. Heavier and designed for different purposes, but the fundamentals were the same. Breathe slowly, squeeze the trigger, gently account for wind and distance, wait for the moment when everything aligns. He had been doing this since he was old enough to hold a rifle, learning from his father and grandfather, practicing until shooting became instinct rather than conscious thought. The other soldiers in his unit were mostly farm boys and city workers, young men who had never fired a gun before or who had only shot at tin cans and bottles. They struggled with the rifles, flinched when they fired, could not understand why they missed. The sergeants yelled at them and called them worthless and threatened them with punishment details. Joseph said nothing, just shot and hit what he aimed at, every time. One of the other soldiers was a young man named William Mackenzie, Scottish-American from Minnesota, who had worked in a lumber mill before enlisting. William was friendly in a way that made Joseph uncomfortable. Most white men Joseph had known were either hostile or condescending. William was neither. He genuinely seemed to want to be friends. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" William asked one evening after training. "Hunting," Joseph said. "I went hunting once," William said. "Never hit anything, made too much noise, I guess. How do you do it?" "You have to become part of the forest," Joseph said. "Move like wind. Be patient like stone." William laughed not unkindly. "That sounds like poetry," he said. "But I guess it works." They became something like friends, not close. Joseph kept his distance because he had learned that white men's friendship often came with conditions and expectations. But William was decent, and in the Army, decent was rare enough to be worth something. "Have you ever killed anyone?" William asked one night. "Not yet," Joseph said. William nodded. "Me neither. I wonder what it will be like." Joseph did not answer. Old Bear had killed men in the old days when tribal conflicts were settled with war parties instead of government agents and broken treaties. Old Bear never spoke of it directly, but Joseph had heard stories. He knew his grandfather carried those deaths with him, knew they weighed on him. Joseph suspected he would find out soon enough what that weight felt like. The unit shipped out to France in February 1915. The crossing was rough. Most of the men were sick. Joseph was not. Growing up on Lake Superior in small boats had given him a stomach that could handle anything the Atlantic threw at him. He stood on deck and watched the gray water and thought about Madeline Island, wondered if he would ever see it again. They arrived in France and went almost immediately to the trenches in Belgium. Joseph got his first look at modern warfare and realized immediately that nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. The Western Front was a nightmare of mud and barbed wire and constant artillery bombardment. Men lived like rats in trenches that flooded with every rain. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of unwashed bodies and rotting corpses and poison gallon and latrine pits that never got far enough from living areas. Lice infested everyone's uniforms. Rats grew fat on the dead. Disease killed as many men as bullets. But Joseph adapted faster than most soldiers because he had skills that urban volunteers did not possess. He could read terrain and understand how to use it for cover and concealment. He could move quietly even through the debris and wreckage that littered no man's land. He could estimate distances by eye with accuracy that officers found remarkable. And most importantly, he could shoot with a precision that separated him from ordinary infantry. After his first few weeks in the trenches, his commanders noticed that whenever Joseph fired his rifle, Germans died. He did not waste ammunition. He did not shoot at random movement or vague shapes. He identified specific targets, calculated the shot, and killed efficiently. His first confirmed kill came in March 1915 during a German attack on the American and Canadian positions. Joseph was positioned in a forward listening post, a small crater in no man's land that gave a better view of German movements. It was dangerous work. Listening posts were isolated, vulnerable, often overrun in attacks. But Joseph volunteered for them because they gave him autonomy and let him use his skills. He spotted a German officer directing troops about 300 yards away. The officer was visible for perhaps 5 seconds, standing to point toward Allied positions. Joseph aimed compensated for the slight wind coming from his left and fired once. The German officer fell. Joseph worked the bolt, ejected the empty casing, chambered another round, and resumed watching. He did not celebrate or feel elation. He just killed a man, ended a human life, but he could not afford to think about that. This was war. Killing was the law. He could process the morality of it later if he survived. The commanders quickly recognized what they had in Joseph and began using him as a scout and sniper. Roles that required soldiers who could operate independently in no man's land, gathering intelligence, and eliminating key German targets. This suited Joseph perfectly. The regimented structure of army life, the constant orders and formations and inspections, all of that chafed against his independent nature. But scouting and sniping gave him autonomy. He could use his hunting skills, could make his own decisions about when to move and when to wait, could apply traditional Ojibwe knowledge that had nothing to do with British military doctrine, but everything to do with survival and success in hostile territory. He developed his own methods, techniques that combined traditional hunting practices with what he learned about the specific conditions of trench warfare. He would study German positions for days before taking a shot, learning the routines and patterns, identifying where officers appeared and when guard changes happened, and which positions had the best visibility. He would move into no man's land before dawn, crawling through mud and shell craters and wire obstacles, finding positions that gave him clear sight lines while keeping him concealed. Then he would wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire days, lying motionless in freezing water or scorching sun, watching for the moment when a target presented itself. The waiting was the hardest part for most soldiers. The psychological burden of lying still under threat of death while nothing happened. But Joseph had learned patience from fishing. Those long hours on Lake Superior waiting for nets to fill or lines to pull. He knew how to quiet his mind, how to stay alert without becoming anxious, how to let time pass without frustration. This mental discipline gave him an enormous advantage. German soldiers would eventually relax their guard, would make small mistakes like standing up in a trench or lighting a cigarette or checking a map without adequate cover. And when they made those mistakes with Joseph watching, they died. His kill count began to accumulate. 10 confirmed kills by summer 1915, 20 by autumn, 30 by the end of the year. Each number represented a human life ended, a German soldier who had had his own story and family and reasons for being in this war. Joseph understood this. He was not a psychopath who enjoyed killing. He was a professional doing a necessary job in a war he had not started, but was determined to survive. Still, the weight of those deaths accumulated in his mind, creating a burden that would stay with him long after the war ended. At night, when he tried to sleep, he saw their faces. The officer he had shot first, a machine gunner he had killed at 400 yards, a sniper he had eliminated in a ruined building. Each one a person, each one someone's son or brother or father. He began to understand what Old Bear had meant. Every life you take, you must honor. Do not become what the war wants you to become. Joseph tried. He carried the tobacco pouch his grandfather had given him and made small offerings when he could, whispered prayers in Ojibwe for the men he killed, asked forgiveness, tried to maintain some connection to who he had been before he became a killer. But it was hard. With each kill, he felt something inside him growing colder, some essential part of his humanity crystallizing into something harder and more efficient. The forest hunter who gave thanks for the deer was disappearing, being replaced by something else, something the war needed, something Joseph feared he might not be able to shed when the war ended, if the war ended, if he survived. William Mackenzie noticed the change. "You are different," he said one evening, quieter, like you are not really here. Joseph said nothing. "How many have you killed now?" William asked. "I do not count," Joseph said. But it was a lie. He counted. He remembered every single one. William was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am glad you are on our side." Joseph held him until he stopped breathing, then gently closed his eyes and retrieved his identification tags. That night, Joseph sat alone in a shell crater and performed the ceremony Old Bear had taught him, burned a pinch of tobacco, sang a quiet song in Ojibwe, honored William's spirit the way he honored the German soldiers he killed. After William died, Joseph stopped making friends. It was easier that way. Easier not to care, easier to focus on the mission and ignore the people around him. He became known as the Quiet One, the Indian who never talked but always delivered results. Officers valued him. Other soldiers respected him but kept their distance. That was how Joseph wanted it. By the end of 1915, his kill count had passed 50. By spring 1916, it was over 100. He had become one of the most effective snipers on the Western Front. The Germans began to fear him, though they did not know his name or what he looked like. They just knew that American and Canadian soldiers advancing through certain sectors had an invisible guardian who killed German defenders with impossible precision. They called him Der Geist, the ghost. Joseph did not know this, did not care. He just kept hunting, kept killing, kept trying to survive one more day, kept carrying the weight of every life he took, kept wondering when or if it would end, kept seeing Old Bear's face in his dreams and wondering if his grandfather would recognize him when he came home. If he came home. The Invisible Warrior. Part 2, the Second Battle of Ypres in April and May 1915 was Joseph's first major engagement. The Germans used poison gas for the first time on the Western Front, releasing chlorine from cylinders and watching it drift across no man's land toward French and American and Canadian positions. Joseph was in a forward position when the gas attack came. He saw the greenish-yellow cloud rolling toward him like fog, but moving with purpose and intent. He understood immediately that this was something new and deadly. He soaked his handkerchief in urine and improvised gas mask that Allied troops had learned would neutralize chlorine and held it over his face while continuing to observe German positions through watering eyes. The gas broke French colonial troops who fled in panic, creating a massive gap in the Allied line. German infantry advanced behind the gas cloud, expecting to find dead or incapacitated defenders. Instead, they found soldiers who had improvised protection and were still fighting. Joseph shot methodically at the advancing Germans, working his bolt-action rifle with practiced speed, dropping one target after another. He fired perhaps 60 rounds during that attack, and later estimates suggested he had killed or wounded at least 20 German soldiers, personally slowing their advance enough that reinforcements could arrive and plug the gap. He earned his first decoration, the Distinguished Conduct Medal, for his actions at Ypres. The citation did not mention his sniping specifically. It praised his courage under fire and his effectiveness as a scout. The medal meant little to Joseph personally. He did not fight for decorations or recognition, but his commander's growing respect meant they gave him more autonomy, more opportunity to operate the way he knew was most effective. It was during the gas attack that William Mackenzie died. Joseph had been watching from his forward position when the shrapnel hit. He crawled back through the key and chaos to find William lying in the mud, blood soaking through his uniform. The piece of metal had punched through his chest, and there was nothing anyone could do. William looked up at Joseph with eyes that already knew death was coming. "Tell my ma I was brave," William said. His voice was barely a whisper. "You were brave," Joseph said. He held William's hand. William tried to smile, did not quite manage it. Then he stopped breathing. Joseph sat there for a moment with his friend's body chlorine gas drifting around them, artillery shells exploding in the distance. He gently closed William's eyes and retrieved his identification tags. Then he moved back to his position and continued shooting Germans. There would be time to grieve later. Right now, there was only the mission, only survival. That night alone in a shell crater, Joseph performed the ceremony Old Bear had taught him. He burned a pinch of tobacco from the pouch his grandfather had given him. He sang quietly in Ojibwe, a song for the dead, a song to guide spirits to the next world. He honored William's memory the way he honored the spirits of the deer he had hunted in the forests of Wisconsin, with respect, with gratitude, with sorrow. After William died, Joseph stopped making friends. It was easier that way, easier not to care. He focused entirely on his mission: scout, observe, kill, survive. Nothing else mattered. By late 1915, Joseph was essentially an independent operator. His commanders would give him assignments to scout German positions or eliminate specific targets. Then Joseph would execute those missions using whatever methods he judged best. He had proven himself reliable and deadly. They trusted him, gave him freedom to work. The Somme offensive in summer 1916 was industrial-scale slaughter. British and French forces attacking heavily fortified German positions and suffering casualties that defied comprehension. 60,000 British casualties on the first day of the battle, including 20,000 dead. The bloodiest day in British military history. American and Canadian volunteer units came into the Somme fighting in September 1916, thrown into attacks that ground forward meter by meter at horrific cost. Joseph fought through the Somme, but in a different way than most infantry. While battalions charged German positions in waves that got cut down by machine gun fire, Joseph worked between attacks hunting German machine gun crews and snipers who were causing the worst casualties. He would identify a machine gun position that was devastating Allied attacks, study it until he understood its blind spots and angles, then work his way close enough to kill the gunners. It was dangerous work. Machine gun positions were heavily defended, but Joseph was patient and careful. He moved like smoke through no man's land, used shell craters and debris for cover, waited for the exact moment when he had a clear shot and the gunners were exposed. One shot, one less machine gun killing Allied soldiers, one step closer to ending this nightmare. German snipers who had been picking off Allied officers found themselves being hunted by a sniper they could not locate or predict. Joseph was too careful, too patient. He never used the same position twice, never followed predictable patterns. He would take a shot and be gone before German artillery could target his location. He was a ghost in no man's land, present but invisible, deadly but untouchable. His kill count climbed through the Somme: 50 confirmed kills, 75, 100. The numbers became increasingly abstract, less connected to individual moments and more a general tally of his effectiveness. He had long since stopped thinking about each German soldier as a person with a life and story. They were targets, threats to be eliminated so Allied soldiers could advance and survive. This psychological distancing was necessary for him to keep functioning. But it created a growing emptiness inside him, a sense that he was losing parts of himself with each kill. The man who had pulled fishing nets with his father and hunted deer with Old Bear was disappearing, being replaced by something colder, something harder, something that existed only to kill efficiently. It was during the Somme that Joseph first became aware he was being hunted himself. He was in position watching a German trench when a bullet struck the edge of his crater, sending rock fragments into his face. The shot had come from behind German lines, from a position Joseph had not identified. Someone good, someone who had found Joseph without being seen. Joseph did not move, did not panic. He simply noted the direction of the shot and followed it away. Then he carefully, slowly relocated to a different position. Hours later, he was set up 400 yards from where he had been, watching, waiting. Another bullet struck near his new position. Not as close this time, but close enough to send a message. Someone was tracking him. Someone who understood how he thought and moved. Someone dangerous. Joseph began to pay attention in a different way. Started looking for signs of another hunter in the field. He noticed small things, a position that seemed too perfect but was slightly exposed. Movement that was almost invisible but not quite invisible enough. Muzzle flashes that appeared and disappeared before German artillery could follow up. There was another sniper out there, a German sniper who had been assigned to hunt Joseph specifically, the ghost hunting the ghost. Over the following weeks, the duel escalated. Joseph would take a position and the German would find him. The German would take a shot and barely miss. Joseph would relocate. Hours or days later, it would happen again. Neither man could get a clean shot at the other. Both were too skilled, too careful, too patient. Joseph found it strangely exhilarating. For the first time since William died, he felt something other than emptiness. This was not just killing anonymous targets. This was a contest, a test of skill against an opponent who was his equal, maybe his superior. He did not know yet. Intelligence reports filtered down through the command structure. German prisoners being interrogated mentioned a sniper they feared, an American or Canadian who killed with impossible accuracy. who appeared and disappeared like a spirit. The Germans called him Der Geist, the ghost. They said their own best sniper had been assigned to eliminate him, a man named Klaus Werner from Bavaria, a hunter before the war, over 40 confirmed kills, ruthless, impatient, and very, very good. Joseph took note of the name, Klaus Werner. Now the hunt had a focus, now it was personal. By winter 1916, Joseph's kill count had climbed past 150. By spring 1917, it was approaching 200. Each number represented a choice to pull the trigger. A German soldier who had been in Joseph's sights and was now dead. The psychological weight was enormous. But Joseph had developed coping mechanisms. He focused on the military necessity of each kill, on the Allied lives he was saving by eliminating German gunners and officers. He reminded himself that this was war, that these Germans were trying to kill his comrades just as hard as he was trying to kill them. And he continued to draw on Ojibwe spiritual traditions. He performed ceremonies when he could, small rituals in shell craters or ruined buildings, burning tobacco, whispering prayers for the dead, asking forgiveness for taking life even in war. These rituals kept him connected to who he had been before the war, kept him from becoming entirely what the war wanted him to become, a killing machine without conscience or soul. Vimy Ridge in April 1917 was supposed to be the proving ground. The battle where Allied forces would demonstrate they were elite troops capable of accomplishing what previous attempts had failed to achieve. The ridge was a heavily fortified German position that dominated the surrounding terrain. Allied forces had been trying to take it for years. Now it was assigned to a combined force that included Joseph's unit. The commanders planned meticulously, trained troops on mock-ups of the German trenches, coordinated artillery support with unprecedented precision, gave every soldier specific objectives and backup objectives in case the plan fell apart. Joseph's role at Vimy was different from most infantry. He was assigned to advance ahead of the main assault waves, eliminating German observation posts and snipers that could disrupt the attack. The night before the assault, he moved into no man's land with two other scouts. They crawled through mud and wire in darkness toward German forward positions, reached a shell crater about 200 yards from the German trenches, and settled in to wait for the barrage that would signal the attack's beginning. The bombardment started at 5:30 in the morning, thousands of artillery pieces firing simultaneously, the noise so overwhelming that Joseph felt it through his whole body rather than just hearing it. The ground shook. The air pressure changed. Shell after shell slammed into German positions, obliterating trenches and bunkers and everything in them. Joseph watched through the smoke and fire for targets that survived the barrage. Germans who emerged from deep bunkers to man defensive positions. He saw a German machine gun crew setting up their weapon in the ruins of a trench. 4 men working frantically to get the gun operational before Allied infantry arrived. Joseph aimed at the gunner, the most important target, and fired. The German fell. The loader grabbed the gun to take over. Joseph fired again. Another German down. The remaining 2 crew members dove for cover. Joseph waited. He knew they would have to emerge eventually to retrieve the weapon or face their own officer's wrath for abandoning their position. One German appeared cautiously reaching for the machine gun. Joseph fired. The German collapsed. The last crew member fled. The machine gun sat abandoned, useless, no longer a threat to Allied troops advancing up the slope. Joseph and his fellow scouts moved forward with the assault waves, identifying targets and eliminating them, clearing paths for the infantry behind them. By the end of the first day, Allied forces had taken most of their objectives, a stunning success that exceeded even optimistic predictions. Joseph had fired perhaps 50 rounds during the battle and estimated he had killed at least 15 Germans, though in the chaos of major combat, precise counts were impossible. What mattered was that machine guns and snipers that should have slaughtered Allied infantry had been silenced, that officers who should have been coordinating German defenses had been killed before they could organize resistance. For his actions at Vimy and throughout the spring campaigns, Joseph received a bar to his Distinguished Conduct Medal, a second decoration recognizing his exceptional service. The citation mentioned his effectiveness as a scout and his courage in carrying messages under fire, roles he performed in addition to his sniping. But the full scope of his contributions was not documented in official records. The Army did not publicize snipers the way it publicized heroic charges or dramatic last stands. Sniping was seen as ungentlemanly, a form of warfare that civilized nations were supposed to find distasteful even as they employed it extensively. So Joseph's achievements remained largely unknown outside his battalion, known to officers who valued his skills but not celebrated in newspapers or propaganda back home. Joseph preferred it that way, did not want to be famous for killing, did not want his family reading newspaper stories about how many men he had shot. After Vimy, the duel with Klaus Werner intensified. Joseph found evidence that the German sniper was getting closer. A bullet embedded in his canteen after he had moved from a position. The range and precision told him that Werner was very good. Maybe better than Joseph. Maybe good enough to kill him if Joseph made even a small mistake. Joseph began to think about Werner constantly, trying to predict where the German would position himself, what angles he would use, when he would take his shot. It became a chess game played with bullets. Each man trying to outthink the other, each man knowing that one mistake would be fatal. Passchendaele in autumn 1917 was hell in ways that exceeded even the Somme horrors. The battle was fought through Belgian fields that had been destroyed by years of shelling, turning the landscape into a swamp where men drowned in mud-filled shell craters. Rain fell constantly. The ground could not drain. Soldiers advanced through waist-deep mud while German machine guns cut them down, and artillery turned the landscape into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Casualties were catastrophic. Gains were measured in yards purchased with thousands of lives. Joseph fought through Passchendaele from late October through early November, operating as a scout and sniper in conditions that seemed designed to make both roles impossible. How do you move quietly through sucking mud? How do you find cover in terrain that is completely flat and featureless? How do you take precise shots when you are constantly soaked and shivering and covered in filth? Joseph found ways. Adapted his techniques to the specific challenges of this nightmare battlefield. He learned to use shell craters as firing positions, learned to time his movements to German artillery patterns, learned to shoot in rain and fog in conditions that would have made most snipers give up. His hunting skills from Wisconsin winters helped. He had learned to shoot in snow and sleet and freezing wind, had learned to stay still and focused even when his body was screaming at him to move to find warmth to escape the cold. His kill count passed 200 during Passchendaele, 225, 250. Each number represented a choice to pull the trigger. A German soldier who had been in Joseph's sights and was now dead. The psychological weight of this was enormous. But Joseph kept drawing on his coping mechanisms, focused on military necessity, on lives saved, on survival, and continued his private ceremonies, burning tobacco when he could find it dry enough to light, whispering prayers in Ojibwe, asking forgiveness, trying to maintain some connection to his humanity, trying not to become a monster. It was during Passchendaele that he received a letter forwarded through military mail from the American Red Cross. His nephew Thomas had written to them trying to locate Joseph. The letter was brief. Uncle Joseph, I am 15 now, old enough to enlist if I say I am 16. The recruiter in Bayfield does not check too carefully. Everyone says the war will be over soon. I want to serve before it ends. I want to fight beside you. I want to make you and great-grandfather proud. I leave for training next month. Hope to see you in France. Your nephew Thomas. Joseph read the letter 3 times, then sat in the mud of his shelter and felt something inside him crack. Thomas was 15, a child, lying about his age to go to war, coming to this hell, coming to the place where Joseph had killed 250 men and watched countless friends die and lost pieces of his soul with every trigger pull. He tried to write back, tried to find words to tell Thomas not to come, that this was not glory or honor or anything worth dying for. That war was just mud and blood and bodies and the slow erosion of everything that made you human. But the words would not come. Military censors would block anything too honest anyway. So he just wrote, stay safe. Listen to your sergeants. Remember what Old Bear taught you. Do not be a hero. He did not know if Thomas would receive the letter before shipping out. Winter 1917 to 1918. The duel with Klaus Werner reached its climax. Joseph had been hunting the German sniper for over a year, had traded shots and near misses and narrow escapes, had studied the man's patterns and methods, had come to respect his skill even as he planned his death. Joseph decided to set a trap. He chose a position that seemed perfect, but was slightly exposed, just enough to be visible to someone looking very carefully from the right angle. Then he created a dummy, stuffed his spare jacket with grass and straw, placed it in the exposed position with a helmet on top. From distance, it would look like a man. Joseph positioned himself 30 yards away in a much less obvious location. Then he waited, not for hours, for days, lying in freezing water and mud, barely moving, barely breathing, waiting for Werner to find the bait. On the third day there was movement. 400 yards away, a glint of metal, scope glass catching light for just an instant. Joseph already had his rifle aimed at that position, had been aimed there for hours, waiting for exactly this moment. The shot came, hit the dummy helmet dead center. Perfect shooting. Werner was good. Joseph fired. Through his scope, he saw the German sniper slump forward, saw the rifle fall. For a long moment, Joseph did not move, just watched, making sure, confirming the kill. Then he waited until dark and crawled across no man's land to the German position. Klaus Werner was dead. Shot through the chest, death would have been almost instant. Joseph looked at the man who had been hunting him for a year. He was young, maybe 22 or 23, had a thin face and pale hair, and looked like he might have been handsome before the war hollowed him out. Joseph searched the body for identification and intelligence, found Werner's military papers, found a letter from his mother. "Dear Klaus, be safe. Come home to us. Your father asks about you. Your sister misses you. We pray for you every night." Joseph looked at Klaus Werner's face again, and suddenly all he could see was Thomas, his nephew, 15 years old, lying about his age to come to this war. Thomas's face overlapping with Werner's. Same youth, same features, same future cut short by metal and violence. Something broke inside Joseph in that moment. Something that had been cracking for 2 years finally shattered completely. He crawled away from Werner's joint and vomited into the mud, then sat there shaking. Not from cold, from the realization of what he had become, what the war had made him. He had just killed someone's son, someone's Thomas, a young man whose mother wrote him letters and prayed for his safety, a young man who was probably a hunter before the war, who probably learned from his father and grandfather the same way Joseph had learned from Old Bear, a young man who was just trying to survive, just following orders, just doing his job. Joseph sat in the darkness between the trenches and wept. For Klaus Werner, for William Mackenzie, for the 253 German soldiers he had killed, for his nephew Thomas, who was coming to this hell, for himself, for everything the war had taken from all of them. When he finally returned to Allied lines, he reported Werner's death, said nothing about the rest, just gave the Germans papers to intelligence and went to his shelter. That night, he performed the ceremony for Werner, burned tobacco, sang the songs, but this time the words felt hollow. This time forgiveness seemed impossible. This time Joseph felt like he had crossed a line he could not come back from. He was 26 years old. He had killed 253 human beings, and he was not sure he knew how to be human anymore. The Invisible Warrior, Part 3, Spring 1918. Germany launched its final desperate gamble, the Spring Offensive, a massive attack using new infiltration tactics and specialized stormtroop units designed to break through Allied lines before American forces could arrive in overwhelming numbers. The offensive initially succeeded, pushing British and French forces back dozens of miles, creating panic in Allied headquarters. American and Canadian forces were rushed to threatened sectors, deployed piecemeal to plug gaps and hold crucial positions. Joseph fought through the spring crisis as part of rearguard actions and hasty defenses. This was different from his usual methodical sniping. Quick shots at moving targets. Constant relocation as positions became untenable. Running through German fire to carry messages between units when communications broke down. For this work during the spring crisis, he earned a second bar to his Distinguished Conduct Medal, making him one of the most decorated indigenous soldiers in American military history. The citation mentioned his effectiveness under fire and his courage carrying vital messages. But Joseph barely noticed. The medals meant nothing. Only survival mattered now. Only getting through each day and hoping the war would end before it killed him. It was during a message run in early April that Joseph encountered a column of American reinforcements moving up to the front. Fresh troops, young faces that had not yet learned what war actually meant. He was passing them when he heard a voice call his name. Uncle Joseph. He turned and saw Thomas, his nephew. 15 years old but wearing an American uniform and carrying a rifle that looked too big for him. The boy's face lit up with joy and excitement. Uncle Joseph, I found you. I knew I would. Joseph felt his chest tighten, felt something close to panic, which he had not felt even under the heaviest fire. Thomas was here, in France, in this hell. The boy he had taught to shoot, the boy he had promised to protect. Here where men died by the thousands for yards of mud. You should not be here, Joseph said. His voice came out harsher than he intended. Thomas's smile faltered. I wanted to serve. I wanted to make you proud. Joseph grabbed his nephew's arm and pulled him aside from the column. Thomas, you are 15 years old. You are a child. I am old enough to fight. You were only 23 when you enlisted. That was different. How was it different? Joseph wanted to tell him, wanted to explain that war was not glory or honor or anything worth dying for. That Joseph had killed over 250 men and watched friends die and lost pieces of his soul with every trigger pull. That the nightmares never stopped and the weight never lifted and nothing about this was worth what it cost. But the words stuck in his throat. Thomas was here. There was no sending him back. All Joseph could do was try to keep him alive. Listen to me, Joseph said. Stay with your unit. Follow your sergeant's orders. Keep your head down. Do not be a hero, just survive. Do you understand? Thomas nodded, but Joseph saw the disappointment in his eyes. The boy had come expecting glory and found only his uncle's fear. I will keep you safe, Joseph said quietly. I promise. Over the following weeks, Joseph made it his mission to protect Thomas. He could not send the boy home, could not make him leave. But he could use his skills to eliminate threats before Thomas's unit encountered them. He requested assignment to sectors where Thomas was deployed, moved ahead of American advances to scout and clear German positions, killed machine gunners and snipers who would have torn through Thomas's company. He formed a small unit with Thomas and 3 other American soldiers, kept them close, taught them what he had learned about survival, how to read terrain, when to move and when to freeze, how to use natural cover, how to listen for incoming artillery and find shelter before it hit. Trust your instincts, he told Thomas. You have Ojibwe blood. You have Old Bear's teachings. They kept our people alive for generations. They will keep you alive here. Thomas listened, learned, proved to be a quick student, but Joseph saw how young he was, how unprepared for this horror. The boy had nightmares after his first firefight, threw up after seeing his first corpse, flinched at artillery. All the reactions Joseph remembered from his own early days before the war had ground the fear into something harder and colder. Joseph protected him as much as he could, but he could not protect him from everything. By summer 1918, the German offensive had exhausted itself. The Allies counterattacked in what would be called the 100 Days Offensive, the final push that would break German lines and end the war. American and Canadian forces spearheaded the attacks using hard-learned lessons about combined infantry, artillery tanks, and aircraft to develop tactics that actually worked. Joseph participated in these final offensives, continuing his scout and sniper role. But now his focus was singular, protecting Thomas. Every German he killed was one who would not kill his nephew. Every machine gun nest he eliminated was one that would not cut down Thomas's squad. He stopped tracking his kill count, did not care about numbers anymore, only cared about the next threat, the next target, the next German who might kill Thomas. 400 confirmed kills, 450, 500. Officers tried to keep count for commendations. Joseph ignored them, just kept moving forward, kept hunting, kept trying to keep Thomas alive. The Meuse-Argonne offensive in September and October 1918 was the bloodiest American battle of the war. Joseph's unit was thrown into heavy fighting, advancing through dense forests and fortified positions, taking casualties, grinding forward meter by meter. Thomas was in a squad advancing through a ruined village when German machine gun fire erupted from a cellar. The squad dove for cover. Thomas was hit, shrapnel in his leg. Not life-threatening, but bad enough. He screamed and Joseph heard it from 200 yards away and felt his heart stop. Joseph ran through German fire, did not care about cover or caution, just ran. Reached Thomas and dragged him behind a wall while bullets chewed up the ground around them. Thomas was bleeding badly, crying, saying he was sorry, saying he failed. "You did not fail," Joseph said. "You are going home. You survived." He carried Thomas back to the aid station, half carried, half dragged, German bullets following them the whole way. Got Thomas to the medics and watched them work on his leg. The boy would live, would be evacuated, would go home to Wisconsin and Old Bear in a future that did not include dying in French mud. "I am sorry I was not braver," Thomas said through tears. Joseph knelt beside the stretcher and took his nephew's hand. "You were brave enough," he said. "Now go home and live. Live for both of us. Tell Old Bear I kept my promise. Tell him I kept you safe." Thomas was evacuated the next day. Joseph watched the ambulance take him away and felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, profound relief. At least one person he loved would survive this war. At least Thomas would go home, would have a life, would not end up like Klaus Werner or William Mackenzie or the hundreds of others who had died in this nightmare. For the first time in years, Joseph allowed himself to hope that he might survive too, that maybe the war really was ending, that maybe he could go home to Madeline Island and Old Bear and try to figure out how to be human again. The war grounded on through October, through early November. Everyone knew it was ending. Rumors of armistice negotiations spread through the trenches. But the fighting continued. Men still died. Orders were still given to attack and defend and kill. November 10th, 1918, Joseph was in a forward position observing German lines. Intelligence said the armistice would be signed tomorrow. Fighting would stop at 11 in the morning on November 11th. Everyone knew. Germans and Allies both. Just had to survive one more day, 24 more hours. Joseph had been in his current position for 6 hours. A shell crater 400 yards from German trenches. Had not moved except to breathe. Had not made a sound. The Germans had no idea he was there. They never did. Dawn broke slowly, gray light creeping across the ruined landscape. Joseph watched German positions through his scope, saw movement. An officer emerged from a dugout, unfolded a map, studied it in the dim light, exposed for maybe 10 seconds. Joseph watched him through the scope, a middle-aged man, tired face, probably had a family back in Germany, probably wanted to go home just as much as Joseph did. The war would end tomorrow. This man might survive if Joseph did not shoot. Might go home to his wife and children. Might live a long life and never know how close he came to dying one day before the armistice. But what if he killed American soldiers in the next 24 hours? What if he coordinated artillery that wiped out a squad? What if he gave orders that killed someone? What if he killed someone's Thomas? Joseph aimed, compensated for wind, breathed slowly, squeezed the trigger. The German officer fell. Kill number 547. Joseph worked the bolt, chambered another round, resumed watching. He felt nothing, no satisfaction, no guilt, no relief, just emptiness. Just the weight of one more death added to the mountain of deaths he already carried. That is 547 human beings I have killed, he thought. 547 mothers who will get letters saying their sons will not come home. 547 lives ended because I pulled a trigger, and I will carry every single one forever. November 11th, 1918, 11 o'clock in the morning, the armistice took effect. All along the Western Front, soldiers received orders to cease fire. At exactly 11, the shooting stopped. The silence was shocking. After 4 years of continuous artillery and gunfire and explosions, the sudden absence of noise felt wrong. Unnatural. Joseph stood in the trench with his rifle and tried to process what it meant. The war was over. He had survived. He could stop killing now. But the emptiness inside him did not go away. If anything, it grew larger. Now that the immediate threat was gone, now that survival was no longer the only thing that mattered, Joseph had to face what he had become, what the war had made him. A man who had killed 547 human beings. A man who had performed ceremonies and asked forgiveness, but knew that some things could not be forgiven. a man who was not sure he knew how to be anything other than a killer. He set down his rifle, sat in the mud of the trench, wondered what happened now, wondered if he could ever go home, wondered if Old Bear would recognize the grandson who had left Madeline Island in 1914, wondered if that grandson even existed anymore, or if the war had killed him as surely as it had killed William and Klaus and all the others. Joseph returned to America in March 1919, landed in New York, and took trains across the country toward Wisconsin. Other soldiers were celebrated everywhere they went. Parades, cheering crowds, grateful citizens thanking them for their service. Joseph was ignored or stared at, just another Indian in a uniform. Some people crossed the street to avoid him. Others looked at him with suspicion or contempt. He wanted to tell them he had fought for 4 years in France, that he had earned 3 medals, that he had killed 547 enemy soldiers defending the democracy they enjoyed. But what was the point? They did not care. He was just an Indian. His service meant nothing to them. The ferry to Madeline Island crossed in the late afternoon. The water was calm and dark, and Joseph stood on the deck and watched his home appear through the mist. Old Bear was waiting at the dock. The old man was smaller than Joseph remembered, frailer, 75 years old now and showing every year. But his eyes were still sharp and knowing. They embraced without speaking. Old Bear looked into Joseph's face and saw what the war had done, saw the emptiness, the weight, the changes that could never be undone. He said nothing, just held his grandson and let him know he was home. The community held a celebration. Our warrior returns. People who had known Joseph his whole life welcomed him back, shared food and stories, tried to make him feel normal. But the government Indian agent refused to attend, said he would not celebrate savages pretending to be soldiers. Joseph found civilian life almost impossible to navigate. He had seen and done things that separated him from people who had stayed home, experiences that could not be explained or shared. He had what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1919, they called it shell shock and offered virtually no treatment. The nightmares were constant. Every night he saw the faces of men he had killed. Klaus Werner, the first German officer, the machine gunners, 547 faces that would never leave him. He would wake up screaming, wake up reaching for a rifle that was not there, wake up back in the trenches. The hypervigilance never turned off. Loud noises sent him diving for cover. He could not relax, could not feel safe. Every shadow was a threat. Every movement was danger. His body stayed locked in combat mode even though the war was over. He drank heavily, trying to numb the memories, trying to quiet the nightmares, trying to feel something other than emptiness or terror. It did not work, just made everything worse. He went back to fishing on Lake Superior, trying to reclaim the life he had known before the war. But fishing required patience and calm that he no longer possessed. The skills that had made him a deadly sniper now felt like curses. He would see movement in the forest, and his body would react before his mind could process that this was Wisconsin, not France. Those were not Germans, but deer. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in war made peacetime feel like constant threat. In the election of 1920, Joseph tried to register to vote, walked into the registration office in Bayfield, told the clerk he wanted to register. The clerk looked at him with disdain. "Indians cannot vote," he said. "You are not citizens." "I fought 4 years in France," Joseph said. "I have 3 medals. I killed 547 enemy soldiers defending this country." "Do not care what you did over there," the clerk said. "Here you are, just an Indian, no voting rights, no citizenship. Now get out." Joseph stood there for a long moment, processing the betrayal. He had fought for democracy he could not participate in, had risked his life for a country that did not recognize him as a citizen, had killed 547 men to defend freedom he was not allowed to have. "We were good enough to die," Joseph said quietly, "but not good enough to vote." He walked out, went to a bar, got drunk. Old Bear found him there hours later and took him home. But something changed in Joseph that day. The betrayal crystallized into something harder, something focused. If the government would not grant him rights, he would take them. If America would not respect indigenous people, he would make them respect. He was done asking, done being patient. The war had taught him how to fight. Now he would fight a different war. Joseph became active in indigenous rights advocacy. He joined with other Native leaders to fight against government policies that oppressed tribal communities. They demanded recognition of treaty rights, demanded citizenship, demanded justice, and Joseph brought his sniper skills to this new war. He studied his opponents the way he had studied German positions, learned their patterns and weaknesses, identified key targets, government officials who could be pressured, policies that could be challenged, media outlets that could be leveraged. He was patient, waited for the right moment, then struck with precision. He realized he was still hunting, just hunting corrupt officials and unjust laws instead of enemy soldiers. The tactics were the same: patience, precision, timing, striking when the target was vulnerable, being invisible until the critical moment. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act passed. Indigenous Americans were finally recognized as citizens, finally granted the right to vote. Joseph testified at hearings leading up to the act, wore his uniform and his 3 medals, told congressmen that some Native people had earned citizenship in blood, but all of them deserved it from birth. "You called me American when you needed soldiers," he said. "Now call me American when I demand rights." The act passed, not because of Joseph alone, but his voice mattered. His service could not be ignored. Decorated war veterans had leverage that ordinary indigenous advocates did not. Thomas returned from France. His leg wound healed. He finished school, became a teacher on the reservation, joined Joseph in advocacy work. Uncle and nephew working together to fight for their people the way they had fought together in France. "You saved me in France," Thomas said. "Now I help you save our people." Joseph taught Thomas and other young advocates how to fight this new war. "Study your enemy," he told them. "Wait for the right moment. Strike decisively. Use whatever weapons you have: words, law, public pressure, media attention. Be patient. Be precise. Be relentless." Joseph was elected chief of his band, used his war hero status as a platform. Newspapers could not ignore a decorated veteran. When he spoke, people had to listen. Through the 1920s and 30s, Joseph fought for education rights, for treaty enforcement, for cultural preservation, for land rights, for justice. He won some battles, lost others, but never stopped fighting. In the 1930s, the government tried to seize tribal land for development, a dam project that would flood sacred sites and destroy fishing grounds. Joseph led a delegation to the state capitol in Madison, wore his full military uniform, wore his 3 medals, walked into the governor's office uninvited. The governor tried to have him removed. Joseph refused to leave. "You sent me to war," Joseph said. "You gave me orders, and I obeyed. I killed 547 men following your orders. Now you will follow the treaties your government signed." He slammed his service record on the governor's desk, used his war hero status as a weapon, demanded the governor explain why decorated veterans were not entitled to basic rights, why men who had bled for America were having their land stolen. The confrontation was covered by newspapers. Public pressure mounted. The dam project was scaled back. Sacred sites were protected. It was not a complete victory, but it was enough. Joseph had learned that sometimes you won by inches, by small victories that added up over time. Through advocacy work, Joseph found purpose, found a way to make 547 deaths mean something. Every policy change saved lives. Every treaty enforced protected communities. This was his real war, the war that actually mattered. And he was still fighting it the only way he knew how, with patience and precision and relentless determination. The nightmares never stopped. The hypervigilance never turned off. The weight of 547 deaths never lifted. But Joseph learned to function despite them, learned to channel his trauma into something constructive, used the darkness inside him to fuel his fight for justice. Old Bear died in 1940 at age 90. Joseph sat with him at the end. The old man looked at his grandson and smiled. "You walk between 2 worlds," Old Bear said in Ojibwe. "Like I told you. But you built a bridge. You brought back what you learned and used it to help our people. That is good. That is what a warrior does." Joseph wept, first time he had cried since Klaus Werner's death. Old Bear held his hand. "The men you killed," Old Bear said, "you honored them. You performed the ceremonies. You carried their weight. That is all anyone can do." Now honor the living. Keep fighting for them. Old Bear died that night. Joseph performed the ceremony, sang the songs, buried his grandfather on Madeline Island, overlooking Lake Superior, the place where Joseph had learned to fish and hunt in the Ojibwe. The place that had made him who he was before the war tried to unmake him. Joseph continued his advocacy work for another 12 years, trained young leaders, fought for his people, never stopped, even as his body wore out, even as decades of combat trauma and PTSD took their toll. He died in 1952 at age 61. Heart failure. His body simply gave out. Worn down by 4 years of war and 33 years of carrying 547 deaths and fighting for justice that should have been given freely. Thomas, now 50 years old, held Joseph's hand at the end. "Tell them I tried to make it worth it," Joseph whispered. "Tell them 547 deaths were not for nothing." "You did," Thomas said. "You made it worth it." Joseph was buried in a small cemetery on Madeline Island. Simple grave marker with his name and dates. No mention of 547 kills. No mention of 3 medals. The obituary and local newspapers focused on his leadership and advocacy work. The United States military barely acknowledged his death. No state funeral, no elaborate ceremony, no recognition that America had lost one of its most accomplished soldiers. For decades, Joseph Nightwind remained largely forgotten outside indigenous communities and military history specialists. American military history focused on famous generals and dramatic battles, not on Native American snipers who had fought with exceptional skill but had not fit the heroic narratives that dominated remembrance. That began to change in the late 20th century. Historians started paying more attention to indigenous contributions to American military history. Researchers discovered documentation of Joseph's service and realized they were looking at one of the most effective snipers in American history, a soldier whose achievements rivaled the most famous snipers from any nation. Books and articles were written. Military historians studied his techniques. Indigenous communities celebrated him as a hero who had proven the courage of First Nations people, while also recognizing the tragedy of a warrior who had been used by a country that did not respect his people. In 2005, the United States government finally recognized Joseph's service properly, posthumously awarded him the Congressional Medal of Honor. In 2012, a Navy destroyer was named USS Nightwind, the first American warship named after a Native American. At the Medal of Honor ceremony in 2005, Thomas Nightwind testified. He was 90 years old, stood before Congress in a wheelchair but with a strong voice. "My Uncle Joseph killed 547 men and died wondering if it meant anything," Thomas said. "He spent 30 years after the war fighting for us to be recognized as human beings. He deserved this medal in 1918. He deserved to vote in 1920. He deserved respect his entire life. We are giving him a medal now because it makes us feel better. But he has been dead 53 years. He never knew." The legacy of Joseph Nightwind is complex. He was an extraordinarily effective soldier who used traditional Ojibwe knowledge to become one of the most successful American snipers in World War I. He killed hundreds of enemy soldiers with skill and precision that German forces could not counter. But he also suffered immensely from his war experiences, struggled with trauma and marginalization, returned to a country that used him in war but oppressed him in peace. He was a leader who fought for indigenous rights and cultural preservation, who challenged America to live up to its stated values. And he was a human being who carried the weight of 547 deaths for the rest of his life. Deaths that were militarily necessary but psychologically crushing. His story reveals truths about war and sacrifice that comfortable narratives often obscure. Indigenous soldiers like Joseph fought for a country that denied them citizenship, volunteered to defend democracy while being denied democratic rights themselves, proved their courage repeatedly, only to face continued discrimination when they returned home. The question of why Joseph enlisted and fought so effectively has no simple answer. Perhaps he fought because he believed in defending freedom, even if America had not extended that freedom to him. Perhaps he fought to prove that indigenous people were as capable and courageous as anyone. Perhaps he fought simply because it was a job that needed doing, and he had skills that made him effective at it. What is undeniable is that Joseph Nightwind was one of the most effective combat soldiers America has ever produced. He killed more enemy soldiers than almost any other individual American combatant, using skills rooted in Ojibwe hunting and fishing traditions. German soldiers who died at his hands never saw him coming, never had a chance to return fire or take cover. He was a phantom in no man's land, a patient hunter who understood terrain and timing and marksmanship at levels that formal military training could not match. The 547 confirmed kills stand as testament to his skill and dedication, but also as a reminder of war's human cost. Each of those numbers represented a person, a German soldier who had his own story and reasons for being in the trenches, who had family and friends and a life that ended because Joseph pulled a trigger. He understood this. The weight never left him, even when advocating for indigenous rights in the decades after the war, even when fighting against government oppression and cultural suppression. Joseph carried the memory of 547 lives he had taken. That burden shaped who he became, influenced how he saw the world, informed his determination that indigenous youth should have opportunities beyond warfare, that they should be able to live in peace with their culture and rights respected. Joseph Nightwind died in 1952, but his legacy continues to resonate. He represents the best of American military tradition, courage and skill and dedication to mission. But he also represents the worst of American civil tradition, the marginalization and oppression of indigenous people who served their country with distinction but received discrimination in return. His story challenges America to reckon with this contradiction, to acknowledge that the same nation that relied on indigenous soldiers in war denied them justice and peace. And his story reminds us that behind every military statistic, every kill count and casualty figure, are human beings who made choices and paid prices that echoed through the rest of their lives. The fisherman from Lake Superior became the deadliest sniper in American history, and none of the 547 German soldiers he killed ever saw who was shooting. That achievement deserves recognition. But the man who bore that achievement's weight deserves to be remembered as more than just a killer, as a leader and advocate and human being who struggled with trauma and injustice but never stopped fighting for what he believed was right.